Okay, so the next step in setting up the dynamic loading kit is to create your world grid asset. To create your world grid asset, simply right-click the folder where you want to create the asset, choose Dynamic Loading Kit, Create World Grid. Rename this asset to whatever you want, it doesn't matter. I do recommend renaming it though. Now you need to specify the group name. The group name is the name that all of your prefabs have in common. So in my example, it's Slice. So I'll go into the group name field and type Slice. And you'll notice as I'm typing in the new name, this expected prefab format changes. This gives you a little hint on what the naming convention is that you need to follow. You just need to make sure that all of your prefabs are in this format. Otherwise, the dynamic loading kit will not work properly. Also, I should mention that if you have trouble understanding what any of these fields are, you can simply hover over the label name and you'll see some information. You can even hover over these choices once you've selected them. Most of the fields and options in my dynamic loading kit have information, have tooltips. If they don't, then they won't have this little star next to them. So if you see the star, that means it has a tooltip. Hover over it to see more information about that option. The next thing you need to specify is whether the cell object type is a Unity terrain, a non-terrain with renderer, or non-terrain without renderer. Now, this is a bit misleading because you don't necessarily have to specify Unity terrain even if you are using Unity terrains. The only time you want to specify Unity terrains as the cell object type is if you need to use the set neighbors functionality. If you don't care about the terrain neighbors being set, aka if you don't care whether there are seams showing between your terrains, then you can specify non-terrain without renderer, even if you're using Unity terrains. This will have a small performance boost. Might not be that noticeable, but it's a good idea if you're not using the set neighbors functionality to go ahead and use one of these other two options. Actually, if you have a terrain, you're going to need to use non-terrain without renderer because there will not be a render component on that terrain. Now, if you're using some other non-terrain object, you can specify either non-terrain with renderer or non-terrain without renderer. Basically, if your object has a renderer component on it, then specify non-terrain with renderer, otherwise non-terrain without renderer. The world type, if you specify non-terrain as your cell object type, you'll see three options here. Two-dimensional using XZ axes, two-dimensional using XY axes, and three-dimensional. The two-dimensional using XZ axes simply means that your world is on the X and Z axis. Now, an easy way to determine what type of world type you have is to cycle through your prefabs and look at what the position, which axis is changing as you cycle through. So as I cycle through, you can see the x-axis, x value is changing, and the z value is changing. The y value remains the same. This tells me that my world type is two-dimensional using XZ axes. Two-dimensional using XY axes will only be used with 2D side-scrolling games most likely, and three-dimensional uses all three axes. Basically imagine a Rubik's Cube, and that's what it is. Now, for my objects, these are terrains, and I do want to make use of terrain neighboring. So I need to specify the cell object type as Unity terrain, and when I do that, my world type, the only option available to me is two-dimensional using XZ axes. The next step is to enter the number of rows and columns in your group. An easy way to determine this is to look at your objects and find the largest row value, which in this case is 4, and the largest column value, which in this case is also 4. This tells me I have 4 rows and 4 columns. which is the default value, so I don't need to change these. The final set is to set my data. In order to set your data, you need to choose one of these methods. The easiest method to use is set using default values, but you can only use this when all of your objects are present, when all of your cells have an object associated with them. This method will set all of the row lengths on your grid to the value specified here. So you can specify it to whatever you want, and it will set all of your column widths to this value specified here also. Now notice it's setting only the row lengths. It's not setting each individual cell's length. This is because every cell on a single row must have the same length, and every cell on a single column must have the same width. Now between these columns, so this is column 1 and this is column 8, these two columns can have different widths. That's fine. But every single cell on a single column must have the same width. Because of that rule, we don't need to actually store each individual cell's width and length. We can simply store the width of each individual column and the length of each individual row. Now for our purposes, I've actually gone ahead and deleted a prefab. Slice 3-2, as you can see, is no longer present. Therefore, I cannot use the set using default values method. I'll have to use one of these two other options. Set using text asset simply uses a text asset to set the data. An example of what this text asset should look like can be found under terrain slicing, other scripts, dynamic loading scripts, example.txt, and for 3D worlds you have example 3D world.txt. Just look that over. Most likely you will not need to use the set using text asset method, but if you've deleted your prefabs for some reason, you may need to use that method. So that text asset there is provided for you as an example of how to go about designing your own text asset. Because I do have my prefabs though, I can use the third option, which is set using prefabs. As you can see, the default row length and default column width fields are still here. These are only used in the case where a single object cannot be found for an entire row, or a single column or a single object cannot be found for a single column. So for example, if I deleted all of these prefabs here, we wouldn't have any objects in row 1 any longer. And therefore, when I press the set data button, it'll use the default row length of 4000. Because I do have a prefab for every row and a prefab for every column, I don't need to worry about these values, and most likely you will not have to either. The next step is to specify where your prefabs are stored. If they're in a folder called resources, simply leave this option checked. If they're not, uncheck it and specify the folder where they're stored. Again, you can right click a folder, choose dynamic loading kit, copy relative folder path to copy that folder path very easily. In our example, our prefabs are stored in a folder called resources, so we're going to leave that option checked. Hit the set data button, and if it's successful, you'll see data status set, and you can see this new button here, display set data in log, and that'll display the data so you can confirm whether it was set correctly. In our case, we can see that every row has a value of 4000, every column has a value of 4000, and every cell is not empty except for cell 3-2, which is empty, which is indicated by the X. One last thing, If you're using a non-terrain with renderer or non-terrain without renderer, you're going to see some additional options down here, some additional offset values. These offset values are used to offset your object within your cell. For example, if we had a circular object here, and let's say that the transform position of this object was at the center of it, if the offset was 0, and we try to load the object at the cell's position, it would load the object here, when in actuality we want the object to be loaded here. In order to get that object loaded into the correct position, we need to specify an offset. So if your object's dimensions match your cell's dimensions exactly, then you don't need to worry about this offset value. It's only when you have an object which is smaller than your cell and you want to position it when you want to have more control over the positioning of that object within the cell. And you can find more information about the offset as well as more information going into detail about these configuration options in the Dynamic Loading Kit full guide, which is found under Terrain Slicing Instructions. So we've configured our terrain. We've configured our world grid, and at this point we're ready to move on to the next step, which is to add the scene components. And we will cover that in the next video. Thank you. Have a nice day.